In my 35 years on the bench in Providence, Rhode Island, I have been called many things inside this courtroom, some of them flattering, some of them, in moments of frustration, considerably less so. I try not to take any of it personally because I understand that people standing before a judge are often frightened or angry or both, and fear and anger have a way of producing words that don't represent the best of who a person is. But I want to tell you something, my friends. The morning a young man in a designer suit looked me in the eye and said what he said, I felt something I had not felt from this bench in a very long time. If you believe that where you come from is something to be proud of, not ashamed of, leave a comment right now, because what happened next in my courtroom is a story about the difference between the price of a thing and its true worth. Subscribe to this channel right now, because every story from this courtroom is about real people, real choices, and what justice looks like when it comes from the heart. His name was Brandon Whitfield III. I want you to hold that name for a moment, the third, because it tells you something immediately about a young man who has never had to introduce himself without the weight of a lineage behind him. He was 26 years old. He walked into my courtroom the way certain people walk into rooms they have decided in advance are beneath them. Chin up. Eyes scanning the space with a mild disdain, the way you look at a restaurant you've been dragged to that doesn't meet your usual standard. His suit was charcoal gray and fitted in a way that suggested it had been made specifically for him. His watch caught the courtroom light every time he moved his wrist. I noticed all of this the way I notice everything. After 35 years, the details are automatic. They tell the story before the story begins. The charge was a traffic violation, failure to stop at a red light camera on North Main Street. The fine was $220. I have had people come before me in tears over $220. I have had people bring in handwritten payment plans because $220 represented a week's worth of groceries for their family. $220 is real money to real people. I want you to remember that. Hit that like button right now if you believe that a dollar means something different depending on who's counting it, and that a courtroom should understand that difference. Brandon Whitfield III approached my bench without being called. My bailiff redirected him gently to the appropriate position. He accepted the correction with the tolerant patience of someone who considers all rules to be suggestions written for other people. He straightened his cuffs. He looked at me. "Mr. Whitfield," I said, "you're here regarding a red light camera citation on North Main Street. How do you wish to respond?" He smiled. It was a particular kind of smile. Not warm, not nervous, not the smile of someone trying to make a good impression. It was the smile of someone who has already decided that this situation is an inconvenience he intends to dispense with quickly. "Your Honor," he said, "this is a simple matter. The camera malfunctioned. I have an expert who will confirm that the equipment on that particular intersection had a documented error rate. I'd like this dismissed." I looked at my docket. There was no documentation attached, no expert report, no technical filing, just a citation and a young man's confidence that his word would be sufficient. "Do you have that documentation with you today?" I asked. "My attorney is preparing it," he said. "Your attorney isn't here today," I observed. "No," he agreed pleasantly. I told him I could handle a traffic ticket myself. I nodded slowly. "What am I going to do with you?" That's what I was thinking. Not unkindly, not yet. Just the quiet recognition of a pattern I have seen before. The pattern of someone who believes that charm and confidence are a substitute for preparation and accountability. "Mr. Whitfield," I said, "without documentation to support your claim about the camera malfunction, I'm not in a position to dismiss this citation today. Do you understand that?" The pleasant expression shifted, just slightly, the way weather shifts before a storm, subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. "Your Honor," he said, "I think you may not fully appreciate the circumstances here. My family has significant ties to this community. My father has been involved in civic—" I held up one hand, the same gentle hand I always use. "Mr. Whitfield, with respect, your family's civic involvement is not a matter before this court today. Your traffic citation is. Share this story right now, because what came out of his mouth in the next 30 seconds is something that stopped every single person in that courtroom cold." He looked at me for a long moment, and then, in a voice that was not shouting, that was almost conversational, which somehow made it worse, he said, "I find it hard to believe that a judge who makes what? A municipal salary is going to lecture me about appropriate conduct." The courtroom went absolutely still. I have been in this room for 35 years. I have heard disrespect in many registers. I have heard it from people who were scared and lashing out, people who had been let down by systems their whole lives and had no more trust left to give, people who were young and stupid and would be ashamed of themselves by dinner time. I extend grace to all of those versions of disrespect because I understand what produces them. What I was hearing from Brandon Whitfield III was different. It was not fear. It was not desperation. It was the casual cruelty of someone who has never once had to consider that the person standing across from him might be worth more than his assessment of them. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for my gavel. I sat for a moment in the silence that had fallen over the room, and I let it do its work. Inspector Quinn, God bless him, was standing perfectly still at his station. His face was the face of a man exercising extraordinary professional restraint. The young prosecutor that morning, a woman named Santos, sharp and fair, 3 years into a career she was building with genuine integrity, had set her pen down very deliberately on her notepad and was looking at Brandon Whitfield with an expression I can only describe as carefully controlled disbelief. I looked at Brandon Whitfield III, and I spoke. Tell me in the comments what you thought I was going to say, because I want to know if you know me well enough by now to have guessed it. Mr. Whitfield, I said, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to ask you to listen carefully, not because I'm offended, though I want to be clear that what you just said was contemptuous of this court, and I will address that directly, but because I think you said something that reveals a misunderstanding so fundamental that it would be a disservice to let it pass without a response. He had the sense to be quiet, the first genuinely wise thing he'd done since walking through my doors. I grew up in Providence, I said. My family came to this country as immigrants with very little. My father worked with his hands every day of his life. My mother raised children on a budget that didn't allow for error. I went to school on what I earned, not what I was given. And when I took this bench, I took it understanding that the people who would stand before me would be, in many cases, people who looked a great deal more like my parents than like you. I paused. That is not a deficiency, Mr. Whitfield. That is the education. Silence. Now, I continued, you mentioned my salary. Let me respond to that directly. I have never once in 35 years made a decision in this courtroom based on what it might do for my personal financial situation. Not once. Because the day I do that, I have no business sitting in this chair. The people who come before me deserve a judge whose compass points to justice, not to comfort, not to convenience, not to connections. I leaned forward slightly. Do you understand the distinction I'm making? Brandon Whitfield III was very still. The chin that had been elevated since he walked in had lowered degree by degree as I spoke. His hands, which had been relaxed and easy at his sides, were now held together in front of him. Yes, Your Honor, he said. The pleasantness was gone. What was left was something more uncertain, something younger. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because the next thing that happened in that courtroom is something nobody in that room, including me, was prepared for. I was preparing to address the contemptuous comment formally, because I do not ignore contempt of court, regardless of who commits it, regardless of their family name or their watch or the Roman numeral behind their name. When Brandon Whitfield did something I genuinely did not expect. He cleared his throat, he looked down at the floor for a moment, and when he looked back up at me, the performance was gone, entirely. What was left was a 26-year-old who suddenly looked considerably younger than 26. Your Honor, he said, and his voice had changed completely, quieter, stripped of its professional coating. I apologize. What I said was wrong. It was disrespectful, and it was wrong. I studied him. This is the part of my work that requires the most careful attention, distinguishing between a genuine turn and a strategic one, between a person who has actually heard something and a person who has simply recalculated their approach. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference. It lives in the eyes, in the set of the jaw, in the quality of the breath that comes after the words. Something in his eyes told me this was real. What made you say it? I asked, not to embarrass him further, because I genuinely wanted to know. Another pause, longer. He looked at the counter in front of him. I've been in a difficult situation lately with my family. Things aren't... He stopped, started again. My father's business is going through some things. The trust that I thought was... It's complicated. I came in here today feeling like I had no control over anything, and I took it out on you. That's not an excuse. It's what happened. I looked at him for a long moment. A trust fund kid whose trust fund was turning out to be something other than he'd been told. A young man whose identity had been so thoroughly constructed around inherited wealth that the first crack in that foundation had sent him careening into a courtroom, throwing words like weapons, because he had no other tools for the feeling of falling. I thought about my own children. I thought about what I tried to give them, not money, because there wasn't always much of that, but a framework, a way of understanding their own worth that didn't depend on what anyone else had built before them. I thought, this young man was never given that framework, and that is not entirely his fault. Before I tell you what I decided, share this video with someone who needs to hear that the things we inherit are not the things that define us, and that it is never too late to start building something of your own. Here is what I did. On the matter of the traffic citation, I held it over. I gave Brandon Whitfield 30 days to return with the technical documentation he had mentioned, the expert assessment of the camera equipment. If the documentation was legitimate and supported his claim, I would consider dismissal at that point. If it wasn't, the $220 would stand in full. No reduction, no courtesy discount based on anything except the merits of the evidence. I want to be clear about that. I did not reduce his fine. I did not dismiss his case because he apologized. The law is the law, and $220 means the same thing whether you're wearing a designer suit or a borrowed tie. The process I gave him was the same process I give everyone, the opportunity to return with evidence and make your case properly. On the matter of the contemptuous comment, I issued a formal admonishment on the record. I explained clearly that comments impugning the integrity or dignity of this court, regardless of who makes them, are treated as contempt. I told him that he had been given significant grace in this proceeding and that I expected him to understand the weight of that. He nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." "Good," I said, and then I said something that I don't always say but that this particular young man needed to hear. "Mr. Whitfield, I want to say one more thing to you before you leave today." He looked at me. "The things your family built, that's their achievement. The man you become from this point forward, that's yours. Those are two different projects, and only one of them can actually belong to you." I paused. "I hope you'll think about that." He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, like he was deciding whether to say something more. Then, "I will, Your Honor. Thank you. God bless you," I told him. "Take care of yourself." He walked out of my courtroom, differently than he'd walked in, less like someone who owned the room, more like someone who had just been given something to think about and was genuinely thinking about it. Hit that like button if you believe that the most valuable things a person can receive are sometimes the ones they didn't ask for and didn't expect. Inspector Quinn came to stand beside my bench during the brief recess that followed. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You know, Judge, most people in that chair would have come down harder on that kid." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. Because coming down harder was what he expected, what he was braced for. I've been doing this long enough to know that the response that actually reaches a person is usually the one they weren't prepared to receive. Quinn considered that. Then he nodded, the way he nods when he agrees but doesn't feel the need to say so out loud. "Let me tell you something, my friends. This is the lesson I carry from that morning, and I want to give it to you directly because I think about it often. Wealth is not worth. I have known this my entire life, but that morning reminded me of it in a way that was fresh and sharp and clear. Brandon Whitfield III walked into my courtroom carrying a name, a watch, and a sense of entitlement that had been handed to him by people who perhaps thought they were giving him the world. What they had actually given him was a very elaborate cage, a set of assumptions about his own superiority that would, if left unchallenged, imprison him far more completely than any ruling I could have issued. My father came to America with a suitcase and a willingness to work. He never owned a suit that cost what Brandon's cufflinks probably cost. But he was a rich man, rich in the way that lasts, in character, in dignity, in the knowledge that every good thing in his life had been earned by his own hands and his own choices. That richness passed to me. I hope I've passed some version of it to my own children. The irony of that morning is this. By the standards Brandon used to measure me, salary, status, the visible markers of economic position, I was exactly what he called me, a municipal judge in Providence, Rhode Island, a man whose family worked with their hands, a man who grew up in a house where every dollar was counted, and I was, in that courtroom, sitting in the most powerful seat in the room. Power and wealth are not the same thing. That is a lesson that arrives for some people early and gently. For others, it arrives late and hard. I hope for Brandon Whitfield III's sake it arrived that morning, and that he carried it with him when he walked back out onto the streets of Providence. About 2 months later, a letter arrived. I'll be honest, I was surprised. It was from Brandon. Handwritten, which itself told me something, 2 full pages. He wrote about his family situation, which had, as he'd hinted, become significantly more complicated in the weeks that followed his court appearance. The trust fund he'd relied on had been substantially reduced due to circumstances within his family's business. He was, for the first time in his life, figuring out what it meant to support himself. He wrote, "I want you to know that what you said to me and about the difference between what my family built and what I build, I've thought about it almost every day. I got a job, a real one. It doesn't pay much. But for the first time in my life, I understand what you meant about things that actually belong to you." He also included, clipped to the second page, a receipt. He had made a donation, a modest one by any standard, but a real one, to a community fund that supports families in Providence who need help with basic expenses, including, he noted, help with court fines they cannot afford. I read that letter twice. Then I put it in the drawer next to Tommy and Eleanor's notes, because that is the final truth of this work, my friends. The cases that look the smallest are sometimes the ones that go the deepest. A $220 traffic fine and a young man's careless cruelty turned into a letter, a receipt, and, if I'm being hopeful, which I always try to be, the beginning of a life more genuinely his own. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position that morning. Would you have come down harder? Would you have been more lenient? I want to know. These conversations matter to me more than you know. And subscribe to this channel. Leave a like if this story gave you something to think about, because that is exactly what we are here for. Stories that give you something to think about. Stories that remind you that justice is not a machine. It is a human act, performed by human beings, for human beings, every single day. God bless you, my friends. Every one of you who built something with your own hands. Every one of you who is just beginning to understand the difference between inherited worth and earned dignity. Every one of you who has been underestimated and kept working anyway. I see you. This courtroom sees you, and in here you are exactly as valuable as anyone else who walks through these doors. I'll see you in the next story, and I promise what walked into my courtroom the following week left every single person in that room without words. I've been doing this for 35 years. I had never seen anything like it, not once. Take care of yourselves. God bless you all.